Tonight, you are going to step inside a house that looks perfect from the outside. The lawn is trimmed, the curtains are pressed. There is a casserole in the oven and a smile at the door, and everything, absolutely everything, is exactly as it should appear to be. Welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. I am glad you are here tonight, wherever here happens to be for you. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it where you are? I find myself genuinely curious about the geography of insomnia. Wherever you are, you have made a good choice for tonight. Because tonight we are going back to a very specific time and a very specific place. We are going to the American suburb of the 1950s. The new suburb, the one built almost overnight on farmland and former military bases after the Second World War ended, and millions of young Americans came home, got married very quickly, and needed somewhere to put the family they were about to have. You probably have a picture of it already. Ranch houses in long, identical rows, automobiles in every driveway, husbands in suits boarding the morning train to the city, wives in aprons standing at kitchen windows watching them go. The picture is accurate. It is also incomplete. Because behind those pressed curtains and those perfect lawns, something else was happening. Something that the magazines did not write about, and the television programs did not depict, and the neighbors were very careful not to discuss too loudly. The women of the 1950s suburb were not simply waiting at those kitchen windows for their husbands to return. Some of them were making other plans entirely. Tonight, we are going to spend time with those women. We are going to understand who they were, what their lives actually looked like, what the world expected of them, and what some of them did instead. We are going to do it slowly, carefully, and with the respect that history owes to people whose stories were not considered worth telling at the time. Get comfortable, pull your blanket up, let the day behind you go soft and distant. We begin, as all good stories do, at the beginning. How 15 million houses changed what it meant to be a woman. To understand what happened behind the doors of the 1950s suburb, you first need to understand how those doors came to exist. The American suburb did not evolve gradually over generations. It was constructed almost overnight, with a speed and uniformity that had no precedent in the history of human settlement. You are going to find the numbers difficult to believe, so I will give them to you slowly. In 1944, the United States passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known widely as the GI Bill. It was one of the most consequential pieces of domestic legislation in American history. Among its provisions was a guarantee of low-interest mortgages for returning veterans, mortgages with terms so favorable that a monthly mortgage payment was frequently lower than the monthly rent a veteran would otherwise have been paying. The effect was immediate and enormous. Before the war, home ownership in the United States was roughly 44% of the population. By 1960, it had risen to 62%. In the intervening 15 years, approximately 15 million new homes were built across the country. The majority of them were in the suburbs. The man most associated with this transformation is William Levitt, a developer from New York who applied industrial production methods to home building in a way nobody had done before. Levitt divided the construction of a house into 27 separate steps and assigned a different crew to each step. A crew would move down an entire street, performing one task on each house before moving to the next street. Houses could be completed at a rate of more than 30 per day.
The first Levittown, built on Long Island in New York beginning in 1947, eventually contained more than 17,000 houses and a population of over 80,000 people. It had been potato fields 18 months before. You are lying in your bed tonight in a world that was partly shaped by this moment. The suburb, the specific geography of the post-war American suburb, is so deeply embedded in the cultural imagination of the 20th century that it is almost impossible to overstate its influence. It shaped films, novels, television, music, politics, and the private lives of tens of millions of people across 3 generations. It also shaped what it meant to be a woman. The suburb was designed in ways both explicit and implicit around a particular model of domestic life. The house faced the street. The backyard was private. The kitchen was positioned to overlook the backyard where children played. The living room was arranged for family evenings in front of the television set. The garage held 1 car, which the husband took to the commuter station each morning. The wife stayed. This is not a cynical observation. For many of the women who moved into those houses in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it was genuinely what they wanted, or genuinely what they believed they wanted, because wanting anything else had not yet become an option they were permitted to consider seriously. Many of these women had spent the war years working. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter, the woman flexing her arm under the slogan, "We can do it," was not mere propaganda. Women had entered the workforce during the war in extraordinary numbers, filling the factory jobs, office positions, and skilled trades vacated by men who had gone overseas. Approximately 6 million women entered paid employment during the Second World War who had not been employed before it. When the men came home, the women were asked to leave. This is a considerable understatement. They were not merely asked. The cultural pressure to return to domestic life was sustained, comprehensive, and came from every direction simultaneously. Government policy redirected the wartime economy away from the industries where women had worked. Popular media produced an overwhelming volume of content celebrating the fulfillment available to women in the domestic sphere. Psychological and medical literature of the period characterized women who preferred work to domesticity as neurotic, unfulfilled, or suffering from an arrested development that proper marriage and motherhood would resolve. The women who moved into the new suburbs were, many of them, women who had experienced a different kind of life during the war and had been persuaded or required to set it aside. They had been told that what awaited them in those neat, identical houses was everything they truly wanted. Some of them found that this was true, and some of them, lying in their own beds in those quiet houses on those quiet streets, staring at ceilings that looked exactly like the ceilings of every other house on the block, began to wonder if the story they had been told about their own desires was entirely accurate. That wondering is where tonight's story truly begins. You are still comfortable, I hope. The ceiling above you is yours and nobody's else's. That is in its own way a significant thing.
You have seen her before, even if you have never met her. She is in the advertisements of the period, smiling beside a refrigerator that has just been delivered. She is on the covers of women's magazines, her hair set perfectly, her apron clean, her expression suggesting that the preparation of a Tuesday evening pot roast is among the most fulfilling experiences available to a human being. She is in the television programs, patient and warm and faintly amused by the gentle chaos of family life, always composed, always available, always there. She is the perfect wife of the 1950s, and she was, in ways that took decades to fully understand, a construction. Not a conspiracy,
not a deliberate deception organized by shadowy figures in boardrooms, though the boardrooms were certainly involved. She was a construction in the way that most cultural ideals are constructions, assembled gradually from the materials available, promoted by those who benefited from her existence, and absorbed by the women who were told she represented their highest potential. Understanding her requires you to understand the machinery that built her. The post-war American advertising industry was, by the early 1950s, one of the most sophisticated persuasion operations in human history. Madison Avenue, the street in New York City that had become shorthand for the advertising world, employed psychologists, sociologists, and market researchers whose job was to understand what people wanted and to connect those wants to products. The industry had been transformed during the war by its experience producing propaganda, and it brought that expertise back to the civilian economy with considerable enthusiasm. The primary target of this industry was the suburban housewife. She was, from the advertiser's perspective, an almost ideal consumer. She was at home during the day when the television was on. She made the purchasing decisions for the household. She controlled the budget for food, cleaning products, clothing, and the 100 other items that a modern domestic life required. She had, in many cases, disposable income for the first time in her family's history because her husband's post-war wages were higher in real terms than anything either of their families had previously experienced. And she was, crucially, slightly anxious. The anxiety was structural. She had been moved to a new place, away from her family, away from her friends, into a neighborhood full of strangers who were also strangers to each other. She was responsible for a household and children with limited support. She was performing a role that had been presented to her as natural and fulfilling, but that she was, in practice, learning as she went. She wanted to do it correctly. The advertising industry understood this anxiety and addressed it directly. Its message, delivered through television commercials, magazine advertisements, and radio spots, was reassuring in its structure, but demanding in its implications. The right floor wax would make your home what it should be. The right laundry detergent would mean your family's clothes were what they should be. The right breakfast cereal would mean your children were what they should be. The subtext was consistent across thousands of different advertisements and products. Your home is a reflection of you. Your family is a reflection of you. If anything is less than perfect, that is a reflection of you. You can hear how that message, delivered daily and from every direction, might produce a particular kind of pressure. The magazines aimed at women in this period are worth spending a moment with because they are some of the most revealing documents of what the culture expected and what it was quietly worried about. Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, Better Homes and Gardens, these were not fringe publications. They had combined circulations in the tens of millions. They reached the majority of American housewives every month without fail. And their editorial content, alongside the advertisements that funded them, painted a picture of domestic life that was aspirational in its presentation and quietly punitive in its implications. The articles addressed topics like how to keep your husband interested, how to manage your household budget without bothering your husband with the details, how to ensure your children did not develop the kind of difficult personalities that reflected poorly on their mother. They offered advice on entertaining, on appearance, on the management of emotions that might, if not carefully handled, make you seem difficult. Difficult was the word that covered everything the culture did not want from its women. Difficult meant asking for things. Difficult meant having opinions on matters outside the domestic sphere. Difficult meant expressing dissatisfaction with the life you had been given, which had been presented to you as everything you should want, and which ingratitude therefore made you not only unhappy, but somehow morally deficient. The perfect wife was not difficult. She was grateful. She was cheerful. She was endlessly, sustainably available. The women who moved into the suburbs and attempted to inhabit this ideal were not weak or naive for doing so. They were responding rationally to the incentives and pressures of their environment, as human beings always do. The ideal was presented to them not as a choice among options, but as the natural expression of femininity itself. Questioning it required a kind of intellectual independence that the culture actively discouraged. But the body keeps its own accounts. Beneath the pressed aprons and the magazine smiles, beneath the casseroles and the carpools and the carefully managed social calendars, something else was accumulating. Not in all of these women, and not in all ways that became visible or dramatic, but in enough of them and with enough consistency across different suburbs in enough different states to constitute something that a researcher named Betty Friedan would eventually sit down to investigate. She called it the problem that has no name. We will come to Betty Friedan in a later section because her story is its own remarkable chapter in this history. For now, it is enough to know that she found the problem everywhere she looked. In the letters women wrote to their college alumni magazines, in the conversations she had with friends and neighbors, in the quiet, persistent, difficult-to-articulate sense that the life being lived did not match the life that had been promised. The perfect wife smiled from the magazine covers. Behind her, in the house the photographer had just left, the woman who had been arranged into that smile was sitting in a kitchen that was suddenly very quiet, wondering what time her husband would be home, and whether the wondering was all there was. You know that kind of quiet, perhaps. Most people do.
In 1957, a woman named Betty Friedan sat down with a questionnaire. She was preparing for the 15th reunion of her graduating class at Smith College, one of the elite women's colleges of the American Northeast, and she had decided to survey her former classmates about their lives. She expected, perhaps, to find the contentment that the culture had been promising women for a decade, the fulfillment of the domestic ideal, confirmed in the lives of educated women who had chosen it deliberately. What she found instead unsettled her so thoroughly that she spent the next 5 years trying to understand it. The women she surveyed were, by every external measure, living the lives they were supposed to want. They had husbands, houses, children, the material comfort of the post-war boom. They were healthy, housed, and, by the standards of most of human history, extraordinarily secure. And yet, beneath the surface of their answers, there was something she could not immediately name. A dissatisfaction that had no specific object, a hunger that the available vocabulary of the period could not adequately describe. She began to call it, in her notes, the problem that has no name. You are lying somewhere comfortable tonight, and I want you to stay there while I take you inside this problem, because understanding it is the only way to understand everything that came after it. The affairs, the quiet rebellions, the prescription bottles, the lives that looked one way from the street and another way entirely from the inside. None of it makes sense without understanding what the women of the 1950s suburb were actually living through. Betty Friedan was not, it should be said, a detached academic observer. She was herself a suburban housewife, living in a house in Rockland County, New York, raising 3 children, writing freelance articles for women's magazines when she could manage it around the demands of domestic life. She knew the problem from the inside because she was inside it. Her method was simple and exhaustive. She talked to women. She talked to a great many women in suburbs across the northeastern United States, in the living rooms and kitchens that were the geography of their daily lives.
She asked them about their experience, and she listened, carefully and without judgment, to what they told her. What they told her was, in its pattern and its consistency, remarkable. They described a feeling that arrived most reliably in the middle of ordinary days, while washing dishes, while folding laundry, while driving children to appointments and waiting in the car. A feeling that was not quite sadness, and not quite boredom, and not quite longing, but that contained elements of all three. A feeling that the person performing these tasks was somehow more than the tasks required, and that the excess had nowhere to go. Some of the women Frieden spoke to had tried to name it themselves and found only inadequate words. One described it as a voice inside her that kept saying, "There must be more than this." Another said she felt as though she were living someone else's life and forgotten whose life was actually hers. A third said nothing dramatic at all. She simply said that some mornings she stood at the kitchen window for a long time before she could make herself begin. The culture had a response to these feelings, and the response was diagnosis. A woman who expressed dissatisfaction with her domestic life in the 1950s was not, within the prevailing medical and psychological framework, understood to be responding rationally to a constrained situation. She was understood to be suffering from a psychological problem whose origin lay within her, specifically within her failure to properly embrace and inhabit her femininity. The psychiatric literature of the period, drawing heavily on a particular interpretation of Freudian theory that had become dominant in American clinical practice, held that the mature, well-adjusted woman found her deepest fulfillment in the domestic and maternal roles. A woman who did not find this fulfillment was, by this framework, immature. She was suffering from what various clinical texts described as penis envy, a neurotic desire to be a man, which expressed itself as the neurotic wish to engage in the public world of work and ideas that properly belonged to men. This framework was not fringe, it was mainstream. It was taught in medical schools, published in clinical journals, and applied in the consulting rooms of psychiatrists across the country. Women who went to their doctors describing the problem that has no name were frequently told, in various forms, that the problem was themselves. The prescription was literal. Tranquilizers had been introduced to the American market in 1955 with the arrival of meprobanate, sold under the brand name Milltown. It was the first drug specifically marketed for anxiety, and it was an immediate and extraordinary commercial success. Within a year of its introduction, Milltown was being prescribed at a rate that made it the fastest-selling pharmaceutical product in American history to that point. Its primary market was women. Valium arrived in 1963 and surpassed everything before it. By the late 1960s, it was the most prescribed drug in the United States. The Rolling Stones would eventually write a song about it, calling it "Mother's Little Helper," a phrase that captured, with uncomfortable accuracy, the way the drug had been positioned and used. It was the chemical management of the problem that has no name, not a solution, a suppression. You are still comfortable, I hope. Your ceiling is above you, and the night is quiet. The women of the 1950s suburb were not, as a rule, sitting quietly with their problem and accepting it. They were managing it in whatever ways were available to them. Some found genuine satisfaction in the domestic work itself, and this is not a diminishment of them. Skilled domesticity is real skill, and the organization of a household and the raising of children are genuine contributions to human flourishing, whatever the culture subsequently decided about their value. But others found different management strategies. Some threw themselves into the social life of the suburb with an energy that was itself a kind of displacement. The coffee morning, the bridge club, the church committee, the parent-teacher association. These were not trivial pursuits. They were the infrastructure of community, and the women who built and maintained them were performing genuine civic work. They were also, not incidentally, finding in that work something that the kitchen window did not provide: purpose, contribution, the company of other people who recognized their competence. Some began to read quietly and often secretly. The libraries of the suburban communities of the 1950s were well-used places, and the women who used them were reading things that their magazine subscriptions did not offer. They were reading Simone de Beauvoir, whose book, The Second Sex, had been published in France in 1949 and translated into English in 1953. And whose central argument, that woman is not born but made, was a lit match dropped into a room full of things that had been waiting to burn. They were reading and thinking and talking to each other over coffee in the kitchens that were supposed to contain them completely. And some of them were doing something else entirely, something that required considerably more discretion than a library book, and would, if discovered, unravel the perfect picture that the suburb had been constructed to present. We'll get to that, but not quite yet. First, you need to understand the geography of the affair, not its morality and not its drama, but its practical landscape, the suburb itself, the specific physical and social conditions that made certain things possible and other things very difficult, and that shaped everything that happened within it.
To have a secret in the 1950s suburb, you first had to understand the suburb itself. Not as an idea, not as the cultural symbol it has become, but as a physical place with a specific layout and a specific social architecture that determined, in ways its designers had not entirely anticipated, what kinds of lives could be lived inside it. You are going to take a small tour tonight, a slow one, through streets that no longer exist in quite this form, past houses that have been renovated and extended and sold several times over since the decade we are visiting. But the bones are still there in many places, and if you have ever driven through an older American suburb on a weekday morning, you have seen something close to what we are describing. The suburb was first, and most fundamentally, a place designed around the car. This sounds obvious from the present, when the relationship between American life and the automobile is so thoroughly assumed that it barely registers as a design choice. But in the immediate post-war period, the car-centered suburb represented a genuinely new model of human settlement, one with profound and not fully anticipated consequences for the people who lived inside it. The houses were set back from the road behind lawns. The lawns were generous by the standards of anything the working-class families who populated many of these developments had previously experienced. There were no front porches of the kind that had characterized older urban neighborhoods, where people sat in the evenings and talked to neighbors walking past. The house faced inward. The social life, such as it was, happened in the backyard or inside. The streets were wide and curved, designed for automobile traffic rather than pedestrian movement. There were, in many of the new developments, no pavements at all in the early years. Walking from one house to another meant walking in the road, which meant that walking was not what people did. People drove. This had a specific consequence for the women who stayed home while their husbands took the car to the commuter station each morning. They were, in a very practical sense, stranded. Not all of them.
Some families had 2 cars by the mid-1950s as the economy expanded and automobile ownership spread. But in the early years of the suburban boom and in the less prosperous developments throughout the decade, a single-car household was the norm. The husband took it to work. The wife stayed home without transportation in a place that had been designed to be navigated by car.
The effect on daily life was profound. Grocery shopping required either planning the weekly shop for the day the husband was available to drive, or arranging a lift with a neighbor, or walking significant distances along roads that had not been designed for walking. Doctor's appointments, school events, social engagements, all of these required negotiation and arrangement and the management of a schedule that the woman did not fully control because she did not control the vehicle that made movement possible. The isolation was not total. The suburb had its own social infrastructure, developed rapidly by the women themselves out of necessity and genuine sociability. The coffee morning was real, and it was important. Neighbors dropped in. Children moved between houses with a freedom that created adult connections between their parents. The suburb was not a silent place or an entirely lonely one, but it was a bounded place. And the boundaries were enforced not by walls or fences, but by the social architecture of the community itself, which was perhaps more effective than walls because it was internalized rather than imposed. The suburb ran on visibility. This is the feature of 1950s suburban life that most requires your attention tonight, because it is the feature that shaped everything else. The suburb was a place where everyone could see everything, and where what could be seen was understood to be a direct reflection of what was within. The lawn said something about the family who owned it. The car in the driveway said something. The state of the curtains said something. Whether the children were well dressed when they appeared in public said something. Whether the wife smiled at the right moments and dressed appropriately for the grocery store and maintained the correct degree of friendliness with the neighbors. All of this was legible. All of it communicated. All of it was part of a continuous performance of domestic normalcy that the community required and monitored, without ever quite making the requirement explicit.
The sociologist David Reisman published a book in 1950 called The Lonely Crowd, in which he described a new kind of American character he called other-directed. The other-directed person, Reisman argued, oriented their behavior primarily around the perceived expectations of those around them rather than around internal values or traditional authority. The suburb, with its radical visibility and its social homogeneity, was the perfect environment for the production of other-directed behavior. You watched your neighbors because your neighbors watched you. This mutual surveillance was not malicious. It was, in most cases, entirely unconscious. People were simply aware of their social environment in the way that people are always aware of their social environment, reading the signals and adjusting accordingly. But the specific conditions of the suburb made this awareness particularly acute and its consequences particularly significant. A woman whose lawn was unkempt was a woman whose household was in disorder. A woman whose children were badly behaved in public was a woman who was failing at her primary responsibility. A woman who was seen leaving her house at unusual hours, or receiving unusual visitors, or behaving in any way that deviated from the established performance of proper domesticity, was a woman who was generating talk. And talk in the suburb was the mechanism of social control. It was not organized or deliberate. Nobody convened a committee to discuss the woman 3 doors down who had been seen getting into an unfamiliar car on a Tuesday afternoon. But it happened through the coffee mornings and the backyard conversations and the careful observations of neighbors who were themselves performing their own versions of the same performance and who had reason to notice when someone else's performance faltered. The consequence of this social architecture was that secrets, to be kept, required careful and sustained management. A woman conducting an affair in the 1950s suburb was not simply managing a relationship, she was managing a performance, maintaining 2 versions of herself simultaneously, and doing so in an environment specifically designed to make concealment difficult. The logistics were genuinely demanding. The telephone was a particular challenge. Most suburban households in the 1950s were on party lines, shared telephone connections that meant your neighbors could, if they chose, listen to your calls. Even on private lines, calls could be heard by anyone in the house, and the house was small. Privacy on the telephone required sending children outside, keeping the voice low, speaking in arrangements and codes that would mean nothing to an accidental listener. Meetings required explanation. A woman who needed to be somewhere at a particular time needed a reason that the suburb would accept. The dentist, a friend in need, a committee meeting for one of the many organizations that structured suburban social life. The reasons had to be consistent, had to be remembered, had to be deployed without the hesitation that betrayed invention. Money required management. A household budget controlled by a husband who reviewed the accounts meant that expenses had to be absorbed invisibly, folded into the grocery money or the clothing allowance, or simply not incurred at all. And yet, despite these obstacles, despite the visibility and the party lines and the budget reviews, it happened, repeatedly, quietly, in houses that looked from the street exactly like every other house on the block. How and with whom and what it meant for the women involved is what we are going to explore in the sections that follow. But first, you need to know one more thing about the geography of secrets. The suburb, for all its visibility in public, had one space that was genuinely private, one space where the performance could be suspended, where the smile could be put down, where the woman behind the perfect wife could exist without audience. The interior of her own mind. Nobody could see in there. Nobody could monitor what she thought while she stood at the kitchen window. Nobody could audit the part of her that read Simone de Beauvoir in the library and felt something shift that was never going to shift back. The secret sometimes began there, long before it became anything that required a party line or an alibi, in the interior of a mind that had been told it wanted only what it had, and was quietly, persistently beginning to disagree.
You have been thinking, perhaps, about the husbands. They have been present in this story from the beginning, leaving in the morning with the car and the briefcase and the suit, returning in the evening to the dinner that was ready, and the children who had been prepared for presentation, and the wife who had managed one more time to make the house look exactly as it should. They have been a recurring absence,
which is perhaps the most accurate way to describe their role in the lives we are examining. But there were other men in the suburb, men who did not take the car to the commuter station each morning, men who were, for various reasons, present during the hours when the suburb was supposed to contain only women and children and the distant sound of lawnmowers. These were the men that nobody talked about very loudly, and they are the ones we are going to spend some time with tonight. The first category was the men who worked at home or in the neighborhood. The suburb was not, despite its reputation as a purely residential space, entirely without male presence during the day. Milkmen made their rounds in the early morning, moving from door to door with a regularity and a familiarity that the culture found both useful and slightly threatening. The same was true of the bread man, the dry cleaning delivery driver, the insurance agent who made his calls during business hours, because business hours were when people were home. These men had legitimate reasons to be at the door, to be invited inside for a moment while something was signed or exchanged, to exchange a few words with a woman who had perhaps not spoken to an adult since her husband left that morning. The intimacy was limited and circumstantial, and usually nothing more than that. But circumstantial intimacy, repeated daily, builds its own kind of familiarity. The milkman occupied a specific place in the cultural imagination of the 1950s, somewhere between a practical necessity and a quiet anxiety. Jokes about the milkman and the housewife were a staple of the comedy of the period, which tells you something about what the culture was simultaneously acknowledging and deflecting. The joke was a container for a concern that could not be addressed directly. If it were entirely without foundation, it would not have been funny. The second category was more significant. These were the men who lived in the suburb and did not commute, the self-employed, the salesmen whose territory was local, the men who worked irregular hours or night shifts and were therefore home during the day, the men who were between jobs, a circumstance that the booming economy of the 1950s made relatively uncommon but not impossible, the men who were disabled or ill and could not work. And then there was a specific and surprisingly significant subcategory that the social history of the period has only recently begun to examine properly. The young veterans who had come home from the war, carrying things that the decade did not have adequate language to describe. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not be named or formally recognized as a diagnosis until 1980. In the 1950s, the men who had returned from combat in the Second World War or the Korean War, carrying the psychological weight of what they had experienced, were described, if they were described at all, as nervous or shell-shocked in the older phrase, or simply as difficult. Many of them drank. Many of them could not hold the kind of stable employment that the decade required of its men. Many of them were, for these reasons, home during the day in suburbs that had not been designed to accommodate their presence. These were not straightforwardly villainous figures. They were damaged men in a culture that did not know how to address damage and that expected them to present the same performance of cheerful domestic normality that it required of their wives. The pressure on them was different in character, but not necessarily lighter in weight. The marriages that contained these men were often, beneath their public surface, places of considerable private difficulty. A husband who drank heavily in the evenings, or who was prone to rages that the wife learned to manage and predict and work around, or who was simply so far inside his own unprocessed experience that he was not, in any meaningful sense, present, even when he was in the house, created a particular kind of domestic loneliness. It was a loneliness that looked, from the outside, like a functioning marriage. And into this landscape came the neighbor. The suburb's social infrastructure, which we discussed in the previous section, brought men and women together in specific and recurring configurations. The neighborhood barbecue, the community association meeting, the informal gathering on someone's back patio on a summer evening, with the children running through sprinklers and the adults talking over bottles of beer that the decade had made newly respectable as a middle-class social drink. These were not clandestine settings. They were the entirely ordinary social life of the suburb, happening in plain sight of everyone. And yet, within them, the ordinary mechanics of human attraction operated as they always do, without particular regard for the setting or the social expectations of the decade. You could meet a man at a neighborhood barbecue. You could discover in the ordinary course of conversation that he understood something about you that your husband had stopped trying to understand or had never tried. You could find that the walk home along the quiet suburban street at the end of the evening lasted a little longer than it needed to. You could find that the accidental quality of the beginning made it feel like something other than a choice, which was important in a decade that had very strong views about the choices women were permitted to make. The affair that began this way did not begin dramatically. It began in the margins of ordinary life, in the small spaces that the performance of domestic normality left unmonitored. A conversation that went slightly further than it should have. A telephone call made from the kitchen while the children napped. A Tuesday afternoon arranged around an errand that took longer than errands usually took. The accidental quality of the beginning made it feel like something other than a choice, which was important in a decade that had very strong views about the choices women were permitted to make.
The women who entered these arrangements were not, for the most part, women in the grip of a grand passion that overwhelmed their reason. They were women making a series of small decisions, each one individually manageable, each one justified in the moment by needs that the available structure of their lives was not meeting. This is not a moral judgment in either direction. It is simply an accurate description of how most human decisions of this kind are actually made, which is incrementally and in response to immediate circumstances, rather than in a single dramatic moment of choice. The researchers and sociologists who studied extramarital affairs in the post-war period, and there were several, found a consistent pattern in the women they interviewed. The affair was rarely about the other man specifically. It was about what the other man represented: attention, conversation, the experience of being perceived as a person with an interior life rather than as a function within a domestic system. One researcher, interviewing women in the late 1950s, recorded a response that she found herself returning to repeatedly in her analysis. The woman she was interviewing described her affair with a neighbor in terms that had almost nothing to do with romance. She said that what she had found with him was simply someone who asked her what she thought, not what she needed from the grocery store, not whether she had remembered to call the plumber, what she thought about things, about anything.
She said it had been so long since anyone had asked her that she had almost forgotten she thought things. You are in your bed, and the night is quiet around you, and I hope that someone, today or recently, asked you what you thought. It matters more than the decade we are visiting understood.
At some point in the middle of the 1950s, a researcher sat down with a set of data that the decade was not entirely prepared to receive. The researcher was Alfred Kinsey. The data was the result of thousands of interviews conducted over more than a decade with American men and women about their sexual behavior. And the conclusions, when they were published, produced a reaction that combined outrage, denial, and the particular discomfort of a culture confronting information about itself that it had preferred to leave unexamined. You are going to spend some time with Kinsey tonight, because without him, the story we are telling has a significant gap in it. He was the person who made it possible for the first time in American history to talk about what was actually happening behind the doors of the suburb, rather than what was supposed to be happening there. Alfred Kinsey was by training and by temperament an entomologist. He had spent the first decades of his academic career at Indiana University studying gall wasps, of which he collected and cataloged several million specimens with a devotion to empirical data that his colleagues found both impressive and slightly unnerving. He was precise, methodical, and deeply committed to the idea that the only way to understand something was to measure it carefully and report what you found without allowing what you expected to find to interfere with what you actually found. In the late 1930s, Kinsey turned this methodology toward human sexuality. His motivation was partly practical. He had been asked to teach a course on marriage at Indiana University and discovered, in preparing for it, that the scientific literature on human sexual behavior was remarkably thin and remarkably unreliable. Most of what existed was either moralistic rather than empirical, or was based on clinical populations, people who had sought help for problems, which meant it could not be generalized to the broader population. Nobody had actually gone out and asked ordinary Americans in large numbers and with rigorous methodology what they did. Kinsey decided to ask. He and his team conducted interviews with approximately 18,000 Americans between the late 1930s and the early 1950s. The interviews were detailed, conducted face-to-face, and covered sexual behavior with a comprehensiveness that his subjects frequently found startling. Kinsey was a skilled interviewer who had developed techniques for establishing trust and reducing the social pressure toward presenting a respectable rather than an accurate account of one's behavior. His first major publication, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, appeared in 1948. It was an immediate sensation. The book was dense with statistics and written in the dry language of scientific reporting, not the kind of text that would ordinarily appear on bestseller lists. It appeared on bestseller lists anyway, because what it contained was genuinely extraordinary in its implications. Among many other findings, Kinsey reported that extramarital sexual experience was considerably more common among American men than the public discourse of the period suggested.
The culture absorbed this finding with varying degrees of difficulty and moved on. Then, in 1953, the second volume appeared, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. The reaction was of a different order entirely. Kinsey reported that approximately 26% of American women had engaged in extramarital intercourse by the age of 40. He reported that this figure had been rising among successive birth cohorts, meaning that younger women were more likely to have had extramarital experience than older women. He reported that women who had had premarital sexual experience were more likely to have extramarital experience, and that education level was positively correlated with extramarital experience among women. The response from the culture was, in some quarters, as though Kinsey had reported that a significant proportion of American houses were secretly on fire. Conservative commentators accused him of attacking the institution of marriage, of undermining American values, of producing research whose primary effect would be to license the behavior it described. A congressional committee investigated his funding through the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation subsequently withdrew its support. There were calls for him to be prosecuted. Billy Graham, the evangelical preacher who was perhaps the most prominent religious voice in 1950s America, declared that Kinsey's findings were an assault on the family. The methodological criticisms that were raised were more substantive and deserve acknowledgement. Kinsey's sample was not random in the strict statistical sense. He had relied heavily on volunteers, on people willing to discuss their sexual history with a researcher, and this introduced potential biases that his critics identified. His sample overrepresented prison populations, which were known to have different patterns of sexual behavior than the general population. His statistical methods were questioned by some of his colleagues. These were real limitations, and Kinsey himself acknowledged some of them. But the fundamental finding that extramarital sexual experience among American women was considerably more common than the public culture acknowledged has been broadly supported by subsequent research using improved methodology. The specific numbers have been revised, but the direction of the finding has not. What Kinsey had done, whatever the methodological debates, was make the invisible visible. He had given the problem that has no name a set of numbers. He had demonstrated with the authority of scientific data that the suburb's surface was not its interior, that the performance of domestic normalcy was, for a significant minority of the women performing it, a performance rather than a complete account of their lives. The decade's response to this demonstration is itself revealing. Rather than engaging seriously with what the data implied about the gap between the ideals the culture was promoting and the lives people were actually living, the dominant response was to attack the messenger, to question the methodology, to impugn the motives, to suggest that the research itself was dangerous rather than that the conditions it described were worth examining. This is a pattern you may recognize from other moments in history when data has arrived to complicate a comfortable narrative. The data does not change to accommodate the comfort. The discomfort eventually has to be lived with. The women in the suburb were living with their own version of this discomfort daily. They knew what Kinsey's numbers represented at the level of individual lives because they were living those individual lives. They knew the woman down the street whose marriage was not what it appeared to be because the suburb's social fabric, for all its emphasis on maintaining appearances, was not actually opaque to its inhabitants. People knew things. They knew which marriages were difficult and which husbands drank and which women had been seen somewhere unexpected on a Wednesday afternoon. They simply did not say what they knew, because saying it would have required them to acknowledge that the ideal they were all collectively maintaining was a collective fiction, and the fiction was what held the social world of the suburb together. Kinsey had said it anyway, in the language of statistics, to an audience of millions. The suburb looked at his numbers, recognized something in them that it could not entirely deny, and decided to be furious about the numbers rather than honest about the recognition. Human beings are remarkably consistent in this. You are still there in the dark, I hope, your breathing slow and easy. We are past the halfway mark of Section 6, and the story is deepening now in ways that will take us, in the sections ahead, into the specific lives and specific choices of the women we are here to understand. Kinsey gave us the scale of the phenomenon. What he could not give us, because his methodology was statistical rather than narrative, was the texture of it. The specific circumstances and specific feelings and specific consequences of individual lives lived in the gap between the ideal and the actual. That texture is what the later sections of tonight's history are going to provide. But before we get there, there is one more number worth sitting with. In Kinsey's data, the women who reported the highest levels of life satisfaction were not, as the culture would have predicted, the women most fully committed to the domestic ideal. They were the women who had maintained some connection, however partial and however managed, to a sense of themselves as individuals with desires and capacities that extended beyond their domestic role. The culture had told these women that their fulfillment lay in their selflessness, in the subordination of their individual desires to the needs of the household and the family. The data suggested something rather different. It suggested that the self, quietly and persistently, tends to resist its own erasure, which is perhaps not surprising. But it was, in the decade of the perfect wife, a radical thing to say out loud. There is a letter in the archives of a woman's magazine from 1954 that the editors never published. It was written by a woman who signed herself only as a reader from Ohio, which tells you everything about the decade and nothing about the woman. She had been married for 7 years. She had 3 children. She lived in a suburb outside Columbus in a house that she described in the careful language of someone who understood that even a letter to a magazine required the maintenance of a certain performance as comfortable and well kept. She wrote that she had recently done something she could not tell anyone about. She did not describe what the something was in terms that would have allowed the magazine's editors to publish the letter, even if they had wanted to. She was careful in that way. But she described what it had meant to her with a precision and a feeling that had clearly cost her something to put on paper. She wrote that for the first time in several years she had felt like a person who existed. Not a wife, not a mother, not a function within a household, a person with a name and a history and an interior life and desires that were hers rather than the household's. She wrote that she understood this was wrong and that she was not asking the magazine to tell her it was right. She was simply, she said, reporting something true. The letter was found decades later in the archive, filed in a folder marked unsuitable, and it is as good a place as any to begin the section of tonight's history concerned with what the women of the 1950 suburb actually felt as opposed to what they were supposed to feel, and how they found ways to express it in a decade that had very limited tolerance for the expression. You are still there in the quiet dark, I hope. This section is going to ask something slightly different of you than the previous ones. Not analysis, not the processing of statistics or the mapping of social structures. Something closer to simply being present with another human being's experience across the distance of 70 years and recognizing in it whatever it is that you recognize. Because the feeling that the woman from Ohio described, the feeling of suddenly existing as a person rather than a function, is a feeling not confined to the 1950s suburb. It is one of the oldest and most persistent feelings in human experience. The longing to be perceived, the need to be known by someone in some way that goes beneath the performance. The 1950s suburb did not invent this longing. It simply created conditions in which the longing was particularly acute and particularly difficult to address through legitimate means. The language available to women for describing their interior experience in this period was remarkably limited. This is not simply a matter of vocabulary, it is a matter of what the culture permitted to be real. An experience that cannot be named tends to be experienced as private aberration rather than shared condition, which means the person having it believes themselves to be alone in it, which means they do not speak of it to others, which means it remains unnamed, which means the next person who has it also believes themselves to be alone. This is the mechanism by which the problem that has no name perpetuated itself. Women wrote letters they did not send. They kept diaries that they hid in places their husbands were unlikely to look, in the pockets of winter coats stored in the back of wardrobes, in the pages of books that were not the kind of books their husbands read. The diary of the 1950s housewife, where it has survived, is one of the most illuminating historical documents of the period, precisely because it was not written for an audience.
The diaries that historians have had access to show women who were, in their private writing, considerably more articulate and considerably more complex than the culture permitted them to be in their public presentation. They recorded frustrations that the decade had no framework for validating. They recorded observations about their marriages that were sometimes clinical in their precision and sometimes raw in their feeling. They recorded, frequently, a sense of living at a distance from their own lives, of watching themselves perform the role of wife and mother from somewhere slightly outside it. And they recorded longing. Not always sexual longing, though that was present too. More often a longing that was harder to categorize. The longing to be taken seriously. The longing for conversation that assumed you were capable of engaging with ideas. The longing for someone to be curious about you specifically, as opposed to grateful for the services you provided. These longings did not always produce affairs. In the majority of women who experienced them, they produced other things. Depression, which the decade diagnosed as a personal failing rather than a rational response to constrained circumstances. The overinvestment in children that the psychologists of the period would later identify as a feature of the suburban domestic model. The channeling of frustrated ambition and intellectual energy into the management of children's development. The sustained, effortful cheerfulness that it was its own kind of exhaustion. But in some women, in the specific circumstances that we have been examining, the longing found a different outlet. The affair, when it happened, was often described by the women who had them in language that was notably consistent across different accounts from different women in different suburbs in different states.
They described a sense of being seen. They described conversation. They described the experience of being asked questions about themselves and finding, to their own surprise, that they had answers. One woman, interviewed by a sociologist in the late 1950s as part of a study on marriage satisfaction, described the beginning of her affair with a neighbor in terms that have stayed in the historical record because of their specificity. She said that the first time she understood something was different was not a moment of physical intimacy. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he had come to return a garden tool he had borrowed, and they had ended up talking at the kitchen table for 2 hours about nothing in particular. And she had walked back through the house afterward, feeling as though the rooms were larger than they had been that morning. The rooms were not larger, but something in her sense of herself had expanded in a way that the house had not been designed to accommodate. This is the texture that Kinsey's numbers could not capture, the specific, ordinary kitchen table quality of how these things began, not in the dramatic register of romance, not in the language of transgression and passion that the culture used when it addressed the subject at all, but in the quiet register of ordinary human connection. The language of longing in the 1950s was therefore necessarily a private language, a language of letters filed as unsuitable, of diaries hidden in coat pockets, of conversations held in kitchens when children were napping and the street outside was quiet. It was a language spoken between individuals rather than broadcast to the community, because the community had made clear that it did not wish to hear it. The consequence of this enforced privacy was that the women who were experiencing these things experienced them in isolation from each other, without the knowledge that the woman 3 doors down was sitting at her own kitchen table with her own version of the same feeling. Frieden's genius, when she finally published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, was to take the private language and make it public, to name the problem, to say in print and to a mass audience, this is not your personal failure, this is a shared condition. You are not alone in the kitchen. The response to that book, the letters that poured in from women across the country, women who wrote that they had read it weeping because someone had finally said the thing they had been unable to say themselves, tells you everything about what the enforced privacy of the decade had cost. But that is 1963. We are still in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, the woman from Ohio was folding her letter into an envelope and addressing it to a magazine that would file it as unsuitable, not knowing that 70 years later someone would find it in an archive and read it slowly in the dark and recognize in it the sound of a person who existed. You exist, too. I thought it was worth saying at this point in the evening.
Not everyone managed the performance indefinitely. Some of them slipped. Some were careless in moments when carelessness was expensive. Some were betrayed by the very social infrastructure of the suburb that had seemed, at the beginning, to offer enough cover. Some simply reached a point where maintaining the dual life required more energy than they had left, and something gave way. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with what happened when the secret stopped being a secret. Because the consequences of discovery in the 1950s were not minor. They were not the complicated, drawn-out, therapy-assisted negotiations that the same situation might produce in a later decade. They were swift, significant, and almost entirely weighted against the woman.
You need to understand the legal landscape first, because it shaped everything else. Divorce law in the United States in the 1950s operated on a fault basis in almost every state. This meant that to obtain a divorce, one party had to prove that the other had committed a specific legal wrong. The grounds for divorce varied slightly by state, but generally included adultery, cruelty, abandonment, and in some states, habitual drunkenness. Without provable fault on one side, a divorce could not be granted, regardless of how unhappy or how genuinely broken the marriage had become. This framework had profound implications for a woman whose affair had been discovered. Adultery was not only a ground for divorce. In many states, it was a criminal offense, technically prosecutable, though prosecution was rare in practice. More significantly, for the practical realities of suburban life, it was a ground that affected the financial settlement of a divorce in ways that fell almost entirely on the woman. A wife found guilty of adultery in the 1950s was a woman potentially left with no financial support, dependent on family, if she had family able to help, or on whatever low-wage work she could find in an economy that paid women significantly less than men for equivalent work, and that had limited options for women without recent professional experience. The children complicated this further. Custody law in the 1950s generally favored mothers, operating on a principle called the tender years doctrine, which held that young children were best served by remaining with their mother. But adultery could override this presumption. A mother found guilty of adultery could lose custody of her children to a husband who was able to present himself as the morally suitable parent, regardless of the actual quality of either parent's relationship with the children. The threat of losing her children was, for many women, the most effective mechanism of control the legal system possessed. This is not speculation or retrospective analysis. It appears explicitly in the accounts of women who were discovered and who described their experience to researchers in subsequent decades. The first thought, frequently, was not about the marriage or the husband or the other man. It was about the children. Where would the children go? Whether the husband would use what he knew. Whether the threat, spoken or unspoken, would be deployed. Sometimes it was spoken very directly. One woman, describing her situation to a sociologist in the early 1960s, recalled her husband telling her on the night he confronted her that she could do whatever she liked with her life, but that she would do it without the children. She described sitting in the kitchen after he had gone to bed, in the same kitchen where so much of the life she was now losing had been managed, and understanding with complete clarity that the choice she faced was not between her marriage and her freedom. It was between her freedom and her children. She chose her children. She ended the affair. She remained in the marriage for another 11 years until the divorce laws changed and fault was no longer required. She described the 11 years without particular bitterness, which is perhaps the most unsettling part of her account. She had simply made the calculation that the situation required and lived inside it. People are remarkably capable of adapting to the conditions they cannot change. Not all discoveries ended in confrontation and ultimatum. Some husbands, on discovering or suspecting an affair, chose silence. This was not necessarily generosity. It was sometimes its own form of control, the knowledge held in reserve, the unspoken awareness that created a shift in the balance of the marriage that both parties understood without either acknowledging. A marriage in which the husband knew and had chosen not to act was a marriage in which the wife's position had changed in ways that were difficult to name but consistently felt. She owed something now. The debt was not defined and could not be paid because it was never explicitly stated, but it was present in the texture of daily life, in the way certain conversations ended and certain requests were made. Some women described this as worse than the confrontation would have been. The suburb's social community presented its own separate set of consequences that operated alongside and sometimes independently of the marriage itself. Talk, which we established earlier as the suburb's primary mechanism of social control, moved quickly and without particular concern for accuracy. A woman who had been discovered or even credibly suspected found her social position shifting in ways that were difficult to address because they were never formally stated. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations at the coffee morning acquired an edge of careful distance. Other women, performing their own versions of the domestic ideal and perhaps aware of their own vulnerabilities, found it prudent to create separation from a woman who had made the separation between the ideal and the reality visible. The social consequence was a form of isolation that was all the more effective for being unorganized. Nobody decided to exclude her. It simply happened through the accumulated small decisions of a community protecting its own fiction. The men involved in these affairs escaped the majority of these consequences. This is a straightforward historical observation rather than an editorial comment, though you are welcome to feel whatever you feel about it. A man discovered in an extramarital affair in the 1950s faced social censure that was real but significantly lighter in practical weight than what the woman faced. He retained his income. He retained his professional standing in most cases. He retained his children if the marriage ended, not automatically, but with far greater legal and financial resources to pursue custody if he chose. The asymmetry was so thoroughly built into the structure of the decade that it was largely invisible to the people living inside it. It was simply the way things were, which is how structural inequality always presents itself to those who benefit from it. The women who were caught understood the asymmetry very clearly. They had no difficulty naming it in the private language of diaries and unsent letters and the careful conversations they had with the few people they trusted. They simply had no mechanism for changing it. That mechanism was coming. It was building in the margins of the culture, in the books being written, and the organizations being formed, and the conversations being had in kitchens and library reading rooms across the country. But in the 1950s, it had not yet arrived with sufficient force to change the conditions on the ground. The women who were caught in the 1950s navigated the consequences with the resources available to them, which were limited, and with a resilience that the decade did not always deserve from them. They managed, most of them, in the ways that people manage when the alternative is unacceptable. You are still there, I think. The night around you is quieter now than it was when we began. Some of them left, not many, not by the standards of what would come in the decade that followed, when divorce rates would begin their long climb, and the cultural permission to leave a marriage that was not working would slowly, unevenly, and with considerable resistance begin to expand. In the 1950s, Leaving was still an act that required a particular combination of circumstances and courage and desperation that most women could not assemble all at once. But some of them did it anyway. Tonight, we are going to spend time with those women, not because they were more admirable than the women who stayed, and not because leaving was always the right choice or even a genuinely free one, but because their stories illuminate something about the decade that the stories of the women who stayed, however rich and however significant, cannot quite show us in the same way. The women who left show us where the edges of the 1950s were. The decision to leave a marriage in the 1950s began, in almost every case, long before it became a decision. It began as a thought that arrived uninvited and was immediately dismissed. Then it arrived again, slightly less uninvited. Then it became something that was considered, seriously and with full awareness of the consequences, in the private hours when the house was quiet and the performance was suspended and a woman was alone with the version of herself that existed beneath the role. The practical obstacles were, as we have established, formidable. Money was the most immediate. A woman leaving a marriage in the 1950s was leaving the primary source of her financial support in an economy that offered women limited options for replacing it. The jobs available to women who had been out of the workforce for several years were concentrated in a narrow band of low-wage occupations: secretary, teacher, nurse, shop assistant. The wages were low by design, structured around the assumption that women's earnings were supplementary rather than primary, pocket money added to a husband's real income rather than the sole support of a household. A woman leaving with children was leaving with dependents she now had to support on those wages, in a housing market that had been built around the assumption of the two-parent household, and that offered limited options for single mothers in the specific geography of the suburb, where everything required a car, and a car required money. And she was leaving into a social landscape that had very clear views about what a divorcee was in the 1950s. The divorcee of the 1950s occupied an uncomfortable position in the suburban social world. She was simultaneously an object of sympathy and an object of suspicion. Sympathy because something had clearly gone wrong in her domestic life, which the culture understood as primarily her responsibility. Suspicion because a woman without a husband was understood in the particular social logic of the suburb as a potential threat to the marriages around her. This was not a subtle undercurrent. It was stated relatively openly in the advice literature of the period and enacted in the social behavior of suburban communities toward divorced women. Other wives were advised, in various magazine articles and etiquette guides, to be cautious about including a divorced woman in couples-based social events. The divorced woman might, through loneliness or inclination, direct attention toward husbands that was better directed elsewhere. The divorced woman understood this dynamic because she had been one of the wives who enacted it before she became the divorced woman herself. She had attended the coffee mornings and heard the careful, distancing language used about other women in similar situations. She knew what was waiting for her on the other side of the decision. She left anyway. The women who left in the 1950s tended to share certain characteristics that the social history of the period has identified with some consistency. They were more likely to have had some professional experience before marriage, even if that experience was now years in the past. The memory of economic independence, however modest, made the prospect of pursuing it again less abstract and less terrifying than it was for women who had never had it. They were more likely to have strong relationships with their own families, parents or siblings, who could provide practical support in the immediate aftermath of leaving. The suburb's geography of isolation was particularly difficult for women without this network. The ones who left were often the ones who had maintained connections outside the suburban bubble. Women who had kept up friendships from before their marriage, who had family within reach, who had not allowed the suburb to become the entire perimeter of their world. And they were more likely, though this is harder to quantify, to have reached a point where the cost of staying had become, in their private calculation, higher than the cost of leave-it. This calculation was not made once. It was made repeatedly over months or years, revised as circumstances changed, as children grew older and slightly less dependent, as marriages became more or less tolerable, as the specific combination of desperation and courage required to act finally assembled itself into something sufficient.
One woman who left her marriage in 1957 and spent the following years working as a secretary in Columbus, Ohio, while raising 2 children in a small apartment, described the moment she made the final decision in terms that were entirely undramatic. She said she was washing dishes one evening after her husband had gone to bed, standing at the kitchen sink that she had stood at 10,000 times before, and she understood with complete and sudden clarity that she was going to be standing at this sink for the rest of her life. Not this specific sink, perhaps, but this experience, this particular quality of invisibility within her own home, this being present in a place where her presence was required, but her person was not particularly noticed. She said the thought that followed was so simple that it almost embarrassed her to report it. She thought, "I do not want to do this anymore." Not, "I cannot bear it," not, "I am breaking," not any of the dramatic registers that the situation might have seemed to call for. Simply, "I do not want to do this anymore," as though she had finally been asked a direct question and had given a direct answer. She filed for divorce 3 months later on grounds of mental cruelty, which was the ground that most divorce lawyers of the period recommended to women who had no evidence of physical abuse and needed something the court would accept. It required her to testify to specific incidents of unkindness or humiliation or emotional neglect, which she had, as most married people do, in sufficient supply to satisfy the legal requirement. The divorce was granted. She moved into the small apartment. She took the job. She raised the children. She described the years that followed as the hardest of her life, and also, without apparent contradiction, as the first years in which she felt like the years were actually hers. The women who left in the 1950s were not, on the whole, leaving into freedom in any uncomplicated sense. They were leaving one set of constraints for a different set, exchanging the constraints of the unhappy marriage for the constraints of the single mother's economic precarity and social marginality. But they were constraints they had chosen, or at least constraints that were the consequence of a choice they had made, which is a different thing from constraints that had simply been arranged around them without their consent. The distinction mattered to them. It comes through clearly in the accounts they gave, in the language they used to describe their lives after leaving. The difficulty was real, and they did not minimize it. But beneath the difficulty, consistently and without exception in the accounts that have survived, there was something else. A sense of existing in their own lives rather than in the life that had been assigned to them. You have heard that phrase before in different words from different women across different sections of tonight's history. It is the phrase that keeps returning in the letters and the diaries and the interview transcripts and the sociologists' notebooks. The sense of existing, of being present in one's own life as a subject rather than an object. It is a quiet thing to want. It is a remarkably consistent thing to want across decades and circumstances and the very different lives of the women we have been visiting tonight. You are still there in your own quiet dark, with your own ceiling above you and your own life arranged around you in whatever form it currently takes. I hope it is a form you have had some part in choosing.
In 1960, a small pharmaceutical company called G.D. Searle submitted an application to the United States Food and Drug Administration for approval of a new drug. The drug was called Enovid. It was a combination of synthetic hormones that, taken daily, prevented ovulation. It was, in other words, an oral contraceptive, the first one ever submitted for approval in the United States, and one of the most consequential pharmaceutical products in human history. The FDA approved it in May of 1960. You are lying somewhere in the dark tonight, and I want you to take a moment with that date, because 1960 is where the 1950s end, not just chronologically, but culturally. It is the hinge point, the moment when several things that had been building quietly beneath the surface of the decade we have been visiting began to break through into the open in ways that could not be managed or suppressed or filed as unsuitable. The pill, as it immediately became known, was not the only thing breaking through, but it was the most concrete and the most immediate in its practical consequences for the women whose lives we have been examining. Before the pill, the management of pregnancy was the central logistical reality of heterosexual intimacy for most women. Contraceptive methods existed, but they were unreliable, inconvenient, and in some states, technically illegal under laws derived from the Comstock Act of 1873, which had classified contraceptive information as obscene material. A woman who did not want to become pregnant was managing that desire against a legal and cultural landscape that was, at best, indifferent to her wish, and at worst, actively hostile to it. An unwanted pregnancy in the 1950s outside of marriage was a catastrophe of a specific and well-documented kind. The options were limited, and all of them were bad. Illegal abortion, which was available but dangerous and expensive, and conducted in conditions that killed a significant number of the women who sought it. Adoption, which required the concealment of the pregnancy and the surrender of a child, often under coercive conditions that the women involved were given little choice about. Or marriage, the shotgun variety that the decade's slang had named accurately, conducted quickly and under social pressure, and not always to the man the woman would have chosen under different circumstances. The pill changed this calculation in ways that were immediate and profound. It was not immediately available to all women. In some states, it could only be prescribed to married women, because the cultural anxiety about what unmarried women might do with reliable contraception was sufficiently acute to produce legal restrictions. The full legal right of unmarried women to access contraception would not be established until the Supreme Court's decision in Eisenstadt v. Baird in 1972. But for married women, the pill was available from 1960. And within 2 years of its approval, approximately 1.2 million American women were taking it. Within 5 years, that number had risen to 6 million.
The cultural implications took slightly longer to fully manifest, but they were already visible in the early 1960s in the behavior and the language and the expectations of women who had grown up in the 1950s suburb and were now moving with the particular energy of people who have been waiting a long time into a different kind of world. The early 1960s brought several things simultaneously that compounded each other's effects in ways that made the decade feel, to the people living through it, like something was accelerating. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963 and named the problem that had been living without a name in the kitchens and the coffee mornings and the unsuitable letters for the entire previous decade. The book sold 3 million copies in its first 3 years. The letters that flooded Friedan's mailbox after publication were, by her own account, overwhelming in their uniformity of feeling. Women who had never met each other, living in suburbs that had no connection to each other, described reading the book with the specific relief of someone who has been told that the thing they thought was wrong with them is not wrong with them at all. The civil rights movement, which had been building through the 1950s in ways that the white suburban mainstream had largely been able to observe from a comfortable distance, was by the early 1960s making demands that could not be observed from a distance. The March on Washington in 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The legal and cultural framework of the decade was being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously, and each challenge made the next one slightly more imaginable. The women who had spent the 1950s in the suburb were watching all of this with the particular attention of people who have a personal stake in questions about whether the arrangements of a society are natural and inevitable or constructed and therefore changeable. The suburb itself was changing, not dramatically and not all at once. The ranch houses were still there, the lawns were still trimmed, husbands were still taking the car to the commuter station in the morning. But inside the houses, things were shifting in ways that would take another decade to become fully visible. Women were going back to work. Not all of them, and not immediately, but in increasing numbers through the early 1960s, driven by a combination of financial need, personal desire, and the slowly expanding cultural permission to want something in addition to the domestic life. The women's magazines that had spent the 1950s celebrating the perfect wife began, tentatively and with considerable ambivalence, to include articles about women who had careers. The ambivalence was still there. The articles still framed professional ambition as something to be balanced carefully against domestic responsibility, rather than as a straightforward good, but they were there. The conversation was changing, and the affairs, the ones we had been examining all evening, were changing too. Not disappearing. The research suggests that extramarital activity did not decline in the 1960s. If anything, the loosening of certain cultural constraints and the arrival of reliable contraception created conditions in which the practical barriers to affairs were lower than they had been in the previous decade. But the meaning was shifting. In the 1950s, an affair had been, for most of the women involved, a private negotiation with a private need, a way of addressing something the marriage was not providing, conducted in secret, with full awareness that the secret must be kept, because the consequences of its discovery were severe and fell almost entirely on the woman. In the 1960s, the same act was beginning to acquire a different cultural vocabulary. The language of liberation was in the air, imprecise and contested and applied to many things simultaneously, but present.
The idea that personal life was political, that the private arrangements of households were connected to the public structures of power, was beginning to be articulated in ways that gave individual choices a larger frame of reference. The woman in the 1960s suburb who was managing an affair was doing something that looked, from the outside, similar to what her counterpart in the 1950s had done. But she was doing it in a culture that was beginning, haltingly and unevenly, to ask different questions about why the domestic arrangements of the post-war period had been structured the way they were, and who those arrangements had served. The answers to those questions would take the rest of the decade and much of the next to work themselves out into anything resembling a new consensus. But the questions were being asked, which was itself a change from the 1950s, when the questions were filed as unsuitable along with the letters and stored in folders in archives where they waited quietly for someone to come along and read them. You are nearly the end of tonight's history now.
We have spent most of tonight inside the difficulty, inside the pressure and the performance and the private longing and the consequences of discovery and the hard mathematics of leaving. We have spent time with the unsuitable letters and the hidden diaries and the kitchen windows and the party lines and the careful management of two lives running simultaneously inside one house on one street in one suburb that looked from the outside exactly like every other house on every other street in every other suburb. It would be possible to end tonight's history there, in the difficulty, and the history would be accurate. The difficulty was real. Every detail we have examined has been documented, researched, and drawn from the actual accounts of actual women who lived these actual lives. But it would be incomplete, because the women of the 1950s suburb were not only managing difficulty. They were simultaneously, and with the same energy and the same intelligence they brought to everything else, building something. Not all of them consciously, not all of them with any intention that what they were doing would outlast the decade or reach beyond their immediate neighborhood. But the cumulative effect of what they built in the coffee mornings and the library reading rooms and the parent-teacher associations and the quiet conversations conducted in kitchens while children slept was significant enough that the historians who have studied the period have come to regard the 1950s suburb not only as a place of constraint but as a laboratory in which the conditions for what came next were being prepared. You are going to understand what I mean by that as we go through this section, but I want you to start with a specific and concrete example because the abstract claim is less interesting than the specific reality. In 1956, a group of women in a suburb of Chicago decided that the infant formula their pediatricians were recommending was not serving their babies as well as breastfeeding would. This was not, at the time, a mainstream medical position. The post-war medical establishment had embraced formula feeding with considerable enthusiasm, associating it with modernity, with scientific progress, with the liberation of women from the physical demands of nursing. The women in the Chicago suburb disagreed, and they did something about it. They formed a group. They called it La Leche League, from the Spanish for milk, taking the name from a shrine in Florida dedicated to a Madonna nursing the infant Jesus, which gave the organization a religious respectability that made it slightly harder to dismiss in the cultural climate of the 1950s. They began meeting in each other's homes to share information and support about breastfeeding. They trained themselves, drawing on whatever medical literature they could access. They developed expertise. Within a decade,
La Leche League had chapters across the United States and in multiple other countries. It had published a manual that would go through multiple editions and sell millions of copies. It had changed the medical conversation about infant feeding in ways that the original group of women in the Chicago suburb could not have fully anticipated when they sat down together in someone's living room in 1956. They had built something out of the materials available to them: the suburb's social infrastructure, the coffee morning model of women gathering in domestic spaces, the skills of organization and communication that the decade had trained them in without intending the training to be used for anything beyond the management of the household. This pattern repeated itself across the decade in different forms and on different issues. The Parent-Teacher Association, which had existed before the 1950s but expanded dramatically during the post-war educational boom, was primarily run by women and became, in many communities, a genuine political force. The women who organized the PTA were managing budgets, running meetings, negotiating with local school administrators and local politicians, developing the skills of civic organization that the decade refused to recognize as professional competence, while simultaneously relying entirely on women to perform them.
The League of Women Voters, which had been founded in 1920 in the immediate aftermath of women's suffrage, saw significant growth and increased activism through the 1950s. Its membership was heavily suburban, heavily the women we have been discussing, and its work on voter education and civic engagement was substantive and effective. The women who ran these organizations were not, in most cases, thinking of themselves as proto-feminists. They were thinking of themselves as wives and mothers who cared about their children's education and their community's civic life. The language of feminism, in its second wave form, had not yet arrived to give them a framework for understanding what they were doing. But what they were doing was developing the organizational capacity, the political skills, the experience of collective action that would make the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s possible. You cannot build a mass movement without people who know how to organize a meeting, manage a budget, write a newsletter, negotiate with an institution, and sustain collective effort over time in the face of resistance. The women of the 1950s suburb had learned all of these things. They had learned them in the service of organizations that the culture considered safely domestic and therefore unthreatening. And when the moment came to apply those skills to something that the culture found considerably more threatening, they had them. The affairs, too, built something, not in the same organized sense, not intentionally, but the women who had lived double lives, who had maintained two versions of themselves simultaneously, who had developed the capacity to exist beneath the surface of the performance without being entirely consumed by it. Those women had demonstrated something to themselves that was difficult to unlearn. They had demonstrated that the person beneath the performance was real, that she had desires and capacities and an interior life that did not require the performance for its existence, that the surface was not the whole. This knowledge, once acquired, did not simply evaporate when the affair ended or was discovered, or was simply allowed to fade as the circumstances that had produced it changed. It remained as a kind of private certainty in the lives of the women who had it. One woman, interviewed in the 1970s as part of an oral history project about women's experience in the post-war period, described this in terms that have stayed in the historical record for their precision.
She said that before her affair, she had believed, genuinely and without questioning it, that the version of herself that existed within her marriage was the whole of herself, that the wife and the mother were not roles she was performing, but the actual sum of what she was. And then, she said, she discovered that this was not true. She said the discovery was both wonderful and terrible in roughly equal measure, because once you know that you are more than what the available structures of your life have room for, you cannot unknow it. You carry it with you, she said, into every subsequent arrangement. You carry the knowledge of your own excess. Your own excess. What a precise and generous way to describe the part of a person that the structures built to contain them cannot quite manage. You have excess too, I imagine. Most people do. The night is very quiet now, and we are nearly at the end.
We have come a long way tonight. From the potato fields of Long Island that became Levittown almost overnight, through the pressed curtains and the magazine smiles and the casseroles and the perfect lawns, through the party lines and the careful alibis and the letters filed as unsuitable in folders in archives, through the kitchens where conversations lasted 2 hours about nothing in particular and left the rooms feeling larger afterward, through the consequences and the calculations, and the women who stayed and the women who left, and the women who built things out of the materials the decade gave them. You have been an excellent companion through all of it. It is late now, or early, depending on where you are and what the clock says in your particular corner of the world. The person who told us they were in Israel at 9 in the morning is probably moved on with their day by now. The rest of you are, I hope, somewhere between awake and not quite awake, in that pleasant dissolving territory where the history you have been absorbing begins to soften at its edges and become something closer to dream. Before you go, I want to leave you with something.
Not a conclusion, exactly. History rarely offers conclusions in the tidy sense. It offers patterns and proximities and the occasional moment of clarity that illuminates something you thought you understood and shows you it was more complicated than you knew. That is what we have had tonight, I think. Not answers. Something more useful than answers. The women we have spent tonight with are gone now, most of them. The youngest of the women whose stories we have examined would be in their 90s if they were still alive. The suburb they lived in, the specific cultural moment of the 1950s American domestic ideal, is as distant from the present as the medieval hygiene we discussed in an earlier episode, though it left fewer archaeological remains and considerably more television reruns. But they left things behind. They left the organizations they built, some of which are still operating. They left the legal changes their dissatisfaction eventually helped produce, the no-fault divorce laws that began appearing in the late 1960s and spread across the country through the 1970s, making it possible to leave a marriage that was not working without having to prove that someone had committed a specific legal wrong. They left the shifted expectations that their daughters absorbed, the daughters who grew up in those suburbs watching their mothers at the kitchen windows and decided, with the particular clarity of children observing something they do not yet have words for, that they wanted something different. They left the books. The feminine mystique is still in print,
It is still read, still cited, still capable of producing in certain readers the specific recognition that Frieden's original readers described, the feeling of someone finally saying the thing that had not been said. And they left something harder to categorize. They left the knowledge encoded in the historical record, in letters and diaries and interview transcripts, and the careful scholarship of the researchers who have spent careers attending to their stories, that ordinary life contains more than it appears to from the outside, that the suburb and the marriage and the performance of domestic normalcy and the casserole in the oven and the smile at the door were not the whole story, that behind those pressed curtains, in the interior of those minds that nobody could monitor, something else was always happening, something human and complicated and not entirely containable by the structures built to contain it. This is not a story unique to the 1950s. It is not a story unique to women or to suburbs or to any particular culture or period. It is the story that keeps recurring throughout human history in every era we might choose to examine, of the gap between what a society decides people should be and what people actually are. The gap is where the interesting history lives. It is where tonight's history has lived, from the unsuitable letter, to the kitchen table conversation, to the woman standing at the sink, understanding with sudden clarity that she did not want to do this anymore. That gap and the people who lived inside it, and the things they felt and chose and built and left behind, are as worthy of careful historical attention as any emperor or battle or treaty that the traditional history books have always found room for. Perhaps more worthy, because they are the history of how ordinary life is actually lived by the majority of the people who have ever lived it, in the daily and undramatic and mostly unrecorded spaces between the events that make it into the official record. You are living your own version of that history right now, in the choices you have made about how to arrange your life, in the gap between what the world expects of you and what you actually are, in the excess that the available structures cannot quite contain. You are, whether you think of yourself this way or not, a historical person, living a life that will seem, to whoever examines it from 70 years hence, as specific and as strange and richly human as the lives of the women we have spent tonight with seem to us. I find that thought genuinely comforting in the small hours. The idea that the ordinary life, the one being lived right now in the dark, is already history in the making, already worthy of attention, already interesting if someone is paying the right kind of attention. I have been paying attention tonight. I am glad you were here. Thank you, as always, for spending the evening with the sleepy historian. If you are somehow still awake after 12 sections of 1950s suburban social history delivered at the pace of someone who has nowhere to be, I am mildly impressed and also mildly concerned. There are more videos on this channel, more history told slowly in the dark, more ordinary lives examined with the attention they deserve. Subscribe if you would like to keep receiving this particular kind of company in the small hours. I will be here. I am always here. Good night, wherever you are, whatever time it is. Sleep well.